January 12, 1945. Before the sun rose, the world held its breath. Across the frozen plains of Poland, an army of steel and snow was poised to move, a force so vast, so meticulously prepared, that it would shatter the last illusions of German control in the east. For 3 long weeks, what unfolded would redefine the meaning of speed, precision, and devastation. This was not a battle fought by chance, it was a meticulously orchestrated obliteration of Hitler's Eastern Front. For months, the Soviets had been invisible architects of destruction. While German commanders celebrated the temporary calm of winter, Soviet engineers were quietly converting thousands of kilometers of rail into arteries of war. Tracks shifted, replaced, and threaded into new bridgeheads across the Vistula. In Sandomir, Magnasv, and Puławy, forests, villages, and frozen rivers became assembly points for over 2 million men, hundreds of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces. The scale was staggering, yet the world barely noticed. Newspapers tracked pattern in France. Newsreels cheered the liberation of Paris. And on the frozen Polish plains, the largest concentration of military might in human history gathered in silence. The Germans had no idea what was coming. Hitler's attention was elsewhere. Reserves drained into Hungary, the Ardennes, and other distant theaters, leaving the Eastern Front under strength and overstretched. Intelligence reports, delivered faithfully to the Wolf's Lair, warned of massive Soviet build-up, but Hitler dismissed them as bluff, and his generals nodded in agreement. The reports grew more precise, more alarming. Bridges, rail networks, stockpiles of ammunition, fuel for thousands of tanks already all waiting, and still the enemy refused to believe it. The cold was a constant adversary for German soldiers stationed along the front. Feldwebel Heinrich Krauss of the 48th Panzer Corps stared into the darkness before dawn, counting the miles of snow-covered fields separate him from an enemy he could barely see, yet whose presence he could feel. His hands ached inside wool mittens. The leather of his carbine had frozen to his palm, cutting into his skin. His battalion, once 400 strong, had been reduced to a fraction of that. Replacements never arrived. They slept in shifts, huddled for warmth in a single dugout, breathing smoke from a petroleum stove that scorched their lungs but gave life. For 3 weeks, Krauss and his men had listened to the distant grinding of tanks, the clanging of artillery, the rumble of preparations that carried across the frozen silence. Every heartbeat felt like a warning. And then, at precisely 4:35, the silence shattered. A flash. The ground trembled. A deafening roar rolled across the horizon as 13,763 artillery pieces and nearly 15,000 mortars unleashed hell on the German front. The Soviets did not build to a crescendo. Their barrage was instantaneous, an unrelenting wall of fire, ice, and earth. Krauss pressed himself into the frozen mud of his foxhole as shock waves compressed his chest, rattling his teeth and cracking the ice on his eyelashes. The forest he had counted on for cover was no more. Splintered stumps reached toward a sky lit with explosions. The snow turned black with churned soil and shattered metal. Time fractured. Survival became the only thought that mattered. By mid-morning, Krauss could count only a handful of his men. The rest were dead, wounded, or lost in the chaos. Orders were meaningless, communication lines obliterated in the first minutes of the Soviet onslaught. He led the survivors through cratered fields, past farmhouses in flames, past bodies frozen in the snow. Every step threatened frostbite, every breath carried smoke and fear. And behind them, the relentless advance of the Red Army continued, unstoppable, like a living tide of steel and fire. Across the Vistula, the Soviets had perfected operational art over decades. Their logistics were flawless, railways converted to deliver supplies directly into the bridgeheads, ammunition stockpiled with the precision engineers, fuel staged for tank armies poised to strike. They had learned from history, building not for occupation, but for speed and devastation. Unlike German blitzkrieg in 1940, which relied on improvisation and short supply lines, this was deliberate, calculated, and overwhelming. Every move was measured, every weapon accounted for. The initial Soviet assault carved through German lines with terrifying efficiency. In sectors where Krauss faced overwhelming firepower, the ratio reached 6-1. Entire battalions vanished in the snow, erased before the enemy could react. Artillery barrages were so concentrated that the ground itself seemed to liquefy, and the roar of explosions swallowed all other sound. Soldiers screamed, but the sound did not exist outside their own ears. It was replaced by the omnipresent thrum of destruction. By afternoon, Krauss's platoon, what remained of the battalion, was all that survived. 37 men against the vast tide of an unstoppable force. And yet, As the Soviets advanced, their precision and discipline allowed them to bypass cities that the Germans clung to in desperation. Fortress towns, garrisoned with thousands, were rendered irrelevant as tank armies surged around them. The operational tempo refused to pause. The Germans could not consolidate, could not regroup. They were being erased, systematically and methodically, by a force that combined mass with a sophistication their commanders had refused to acknowledge. By nightfall, the scale of the offensive became painfully clear. German units that had begun the day in full strength had been reduced to scattered groups, struggling through snow, frostbite and exhaustion claiming more lives than bullets. Krauss and his men pressed westward, navigating frozen fields, their senses numbed by the cold, their bodies battered by the relentless march. The Soviet advance had become a machine, consuming everything in its path, moving faster in winter conditions than the German army had in more favorable months. In just 5 days, the Red Army had advanced 130 kilometers. By the 17th, Warsaw fell without fanfare. The capital was a waypoint, not a destination. Cities toppled one after another. Industrial centers fell like dominoes. Tanks never paused. Infantry never faltered. The pace was relentless, the strategy flawless, the execution devastating. In this first chapter of the Vistula-Oder offensive, the Soviets had demonstrated more than firepower. They had revealed the lethal combination of patience, preparation, and operational brilliance. The Germans, brilliant tacticians in their own right, were being outmaneuvered not by luck or brute force alone, but by a carefully choreographed war machine that had been decades in the making. By the end of this initial assault, what remained of Hitler's Eastern Front was a landscape of ruin. Soldiers, civilians, towns, forests, all swept aside by the unstoppable march of Soviet operational art. And as the snow fell, covering the remnants of resistance, the Red Army pressed forward, proving that in 3 weeks, an empire of war could be shattered beyond repair. The dawn of January 18th revealed a landscape transformed. The snowfields were no longer pristine. They were churned with mud, cratered from shellfire, littered with the remnants of German defenses. Feldwebel Krauss and his dwindling group staggered across the frozen plains, every step a battle against exhaustion and frostbite. Only 7 men remained for his original platoon. Each carried the weight of the day before frozen hands, aching muscles, the memory of comrades, ripped apart in seconds by artillery that seemed to come from the heavens themselves. While individual soldiers struggled to survive, the Red Army advanced with methodical precision. The Soviet tank armies moved like a living organism, their engines roaring across the ice, bridging rivers and smashing through fortified positions. In 5 days, they had covered more ground than many armies could in a month. Cities that the Germans believed to be strongpoints were now mere markers on a map. Fortress towns, bristling with defenders, fell as the Soviet columns bypassed them, rendering their garrisons irrelevant. Hitler's obsession with holding every inch of land became a liability, and his men paid the price. The brilliance of the offensive lay not only in its speed but in its logistics. Behind every tank, every gun, every soldier was a carefully orchestrated supply network. Rail lines, painstakingly converted to Russian gauge months early, pumped ammunition, fuel, and rations directly to the bridgeheads. Snow, fog, and German disbelief masked the scale of the operation. Every day, trains rolled uninterrupted, delivering the lifeblood of an army 2.2 million strong. Without these preparations, the Soviet advance would have been a desperate gamble. With them, it became unstoppable. By January 20th, the momentum was staggering. The Red Army had carved a bulge 160 miles wide and 100 miles deep, swallowing German defensive positions faster than commanders could draw new lines. Warsaw, captured on the 17th, had barely paused the Soviet tide. Kielce and Vajge fell within 48 hours of each other. Factories, administrative centers, and supply depots were captured or bypassed. German units, encircled and cut off, were either destroyed or forced into retreat under unbearable conditions. The psychological toll on German soldiers was profound. Krauss's men, trudging through snow up to their knees, saw towns burned and abandoned, villages emptied of civilians, bodies frozen in the open. The silence between battles was deafening, broken only by the distant rumble of Soviet armor. Every step westward was haunted by the knowledge that behind them lay nothing but ruin, and ahead, the tide of steel and fire would not pause. By January 23rd, the Soviet spearheads were approaching Upper Silesia, Germany's industrial heartland. Tanks from the Second Guards Tank Army swung south, cutting off retreat routes, while infantry armies pressed the front. The German 17th Army found itself trapped, strong points bypassed, unable to regroup. Fortress cities, once symbols of stubborn defense, became tombs for tens of thousands of men. Breslau, for instance, became a cage for 80,000 soldiers who watched Soviet columns advance around them. Commanders who clung to Hitler's orders found themselves powerless to influence the course of events. The winter weather, which had once been a shield for defenders, became an ally for the Soviets. Low clouds grounded German reconnaissance, fog concealed movements, and snow muffled the sound of massive tank formations approaching. Every day, the Soviets gained ground that would have taken armies in previous campaigns weeks to capture. The combination of engineering, planning, and operational discipline allowed them to maintain an astonishing tempo 30 to 40 kilometers per day, even through the harshest conditions. By January 25th, Kustrin on the Oder River fell. The river itself became a highway for Soviet forces, its frozen surface supporting tanks and heavy artillery. Engineers quickly established bridgeheads on the western bank, preparing for the next thrust toward Berlin. The Germans could only watch as their defenses disintegrated, their reserves scattered, and their strategies rendered obsolete. The speed and precision of the offensive created a killing ground behind the front where retreating units and fleeing civilians alike were trapped under relentless pressure. The human cost was staggering. Columns of refugees stretched for kilometers, dragged along icy roads by families desperate to escape advancing forces. Soviet aircraft strafed escape routes. Explosions shattered frozen waterways, and thousands perished in a march that became a nightmare of survival. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustave, carrying over 10,000 civilians, became the deadliest maritime disaster of the war, a tragedy overshadowed by the scale of the land offensive. By the end of January, the Vistula-Oder offensive had achieved what few thought possible, a 480-kilometer advance in just 23 days. Warsaw, Włóczków, and Kustrin all fell in a relentless, almost mechanical rhythm. The Soviet army had turned months of meticulous preparation into a feat of operational art, crushing Army Group A and leaving Hitler's Eastern Front in ruins. Entire formations ceased to exist as coherent units. Divisions that had held the line were scattered, retreating through snow and freezing temperatures, abandoning weapons, vehicles, and supplies to the advancing tide. The difference between the Soviet advance and previous campaigns was clear. The German blitzkrieg of 1940 had been a model of speed and improvisation, relying on narrow thrusts and rapid exploitation. The Vistula-Oder offensive was the realization of a doctrine developed over decades' deep battle. It emphasized multiple echelons, sustained pressure, operational depth, and the destruction of the enemy's ability to recover. First echelon forces shattered defenses, second echelon units poured through the breaches, and follow-on forces ensured the enemy could never regroup. What looked like overwhelming numbers to the Germans was in fact precise concentration at decisive points. By January 30th, the operational picture was undeniable. Soviet tanks and infantry had cut across Poland, bypassed strongholds, and left retreating German forces shattered. Cities, rivers, and forests became markers of a relentless advance. The speed, coordination, and depth of planning ensured that no German formation could withstand the assault. The Red Army had turned doctrine into reality, transforming theory into the deadliest operational advance of the war. Even in the face of exhaustion, cold, and dwindling numbers, surviving German soldiers struggled westward. Each step brought them closer to safety but further from their homeland. Kraus, now one of the few left from his battalion, pressed on across the frozen landscape, the roar of Soviet engines never far behind. Every frozen river, every ruined village, every burned farmhouse was a reminder that the Eastern Front as it had existed was no more. The war had changed, and the scale of destruction and precision had left nothing behind but chaos. The Soviet advance was more than a military operation. It was a testament to planning, logistics, and operational art. By combining engineering feats, supply mastery, and concentrated firepower, they had achieved in 3 weeks what had taken other armies months, if not years. Army Group A, once a formidable anchor of Hitler's Eastern Front, was now a shattered echo of its former self, leaving the path to Berlin open for the final push. By February 1st, 1945, the frozen fields of Poland and East Prussia had been transformed into a killing ground. The remnants of German forces staggered westward, beaten, starving, and frozen, while the Red Army pressed its advantage with terrifying precision. The Vistula-Oder offensive had not slowed, it had only sharpened. Tanks and infantry moved in perfect coordination, artillery barrages crushing defensive positions before soldiers could react. Cities that had been considered strongpoints were abandoned, or bypassed. Fortress towns were irrelevant. Garrisons were trapped or destroyed as Soviet columns flowed around them like a river of steel. Feldwebelkraus, now leading only 7 survivors, crossed the frozen Oder River, where the center span of a bridge had been destroyed to slow the Soviet advance. Concrete pylons jutted from the ice like broken teeth, but the tanks did not wait. Engineers established new crossings while artillery support kept the Germans pinned. Behind Kraus, towns burned, refugees fled in terror, and the remnants of his battalion collapsed under exhaustion. Ahead, the Red Army, advanced, unstoppable, relentless, a tide that had no pause and no mercy. The speed of the Soviet advance was unprecedented. In 23 days, they had covered 480 kilometers, nearly 3 times faster than the German campaign through France. In 1940, and against an enemy that knew the terrain, had prepared defenses, and believed itself capable of resistance, Warsaw, Viger, Kov, Kustrin all had fallen. Industrial centers and strongpoints that should have delayed the offensive had been bypassed or encircled. Operational art had become operational reality, a machine of war perfect. Over decades, executing the deep battle doctrine to lethal effect. The scale of destruction was overwhelming. German soldiers had been erased not just by firepower, but by the meticulous concentration of forces at decisive points. Every breakthrough, every exploitation, every follow-on echelon denied the enemy a chance to recover. Where German generals saw a front line, the Soviets saw layers, depth, and opportunity. They crushed formations before the enemy could react, encircled divisions before reinforcements could arrive, and left towns empty of defenders. The battlefield was no longer a line, it was a vast, moving landscape of devastation. Civilian suffering was immense. Columns of refugees stretched for kilometers across snow-choked roads. Families pulled handcarts and sledges, desperate to escape, yet slower than the advancing columns of armor and artillery. Soviet aircraft strafed icy roads, explosions shattered frozen rivers, and thousands perished in the cold. The sinking of the refugee ship Wilhelm Gustave, carrying over 10,000 civilians, became the deadliest maritime disaster in history, a tragedy magnified by the speed and scale of the Red Army's offensive. Survival was a matter of luck, endurance, and timing. By February 2nd, the offensive officially paused on the Oder River, 64 kilometers from Berlin, not because the Red Army had been stopped, but because operational prudence dictated consolidation of exposed flanks. Behind the spearheads lay the ruins of Army Group A, a formation that had begun January 12th with 450,000 men, 4,000 artillery pieces, and 1,100 tanks, now reduced to fragmented units struggling for survival. Entire divisions had been destroyed before they could engage, artillery obliterated, and command structures collapsed. The speed and scale of destruction were staggering. History would remember the German blitzkrieg through France as the pinnacle of mechanized warfare, but the Vistula Oder offensive was something different, something greater. It was not improvisation, it was operational art perfected, decades of doctrine realized on the battlefield. Deep battle theory, conceived by Triant Feilow and perfected by Marshal Tukhachevsky, demanded sustained pressure, multiple echelons, and operational depth. The Soviets had executed it flawlessly. First echelon forces shattered defenses, second echelon forces poured through gaps, and follow-on units ensured the enemy never recovered. Operational theory had become history. Feldwebelkraus finally reached the Oder River on February 4th. 7 men remained from the original platoon. The rest had perished from bombardment, exposure, or exhaustion. Kraus looked across the ice where the bridge no longer existed. Behind him lay ruin and death. Ahead, only the relentless advance of Soviet forces. The human cost had been staggering, yet the operational achievement was undeniable. In just 23 days, the Soviets had erased Hitler's Eastern Front, advanced faster, farther, and more decisively than any comparable campaign in modern history. The scale of the victory was so immense that it would vanish from popular memory in the West for decades. Political narratives of the Cold War minimized Soviet operational sophistication, portraying their armies as crude, overwhelming masses rather than disciplined forces executing carefully crafted doctrine, while military scholars celebrated Normandy or the Ardennes. The lessons of the Vistula Oder offensive were largely ignored: concentration of force, logistical mastery, operational depth, and the ruthless application of deep battle doctrine. In truth, this was the war in its purest, most efficient form, a mechanized symphony of destruction. The Red Army paused on the Oder not because it could not advance, but because the stage was set for the final strike against Berlin, Army Group A was broken. Army Group Center had been annihilated. German forces were scattered, frozen, and demoralized. The Eastern Front no longer existed as a cohesive fighting force. In just 3 weeks, the Soviets had changed the course of the war, proving that meticulous planning, operational mastery, and relentless execution could overcome even the most experienced and determined enemy. This was not merely a military victory. It was a demonstration of human endurance, ingenuity, and coordination on an epic scale. Every engineer who shifted a rail, every soldier who braved frostbite and shellfire, every officer who calculated supply and positioning had contributed to a triumph that would be studied for generations. The obliteration of Hitler's Eastern Front in 23 days was both a testament to Soviet operational art and a human story of courage, suffering, and survival under the harshest conditions imaginable. The world would never fully grasp the scale of the achievement. The destruction, the precision, the speed, they were almost too vast to comprehend. But for those who witnessed it, who survived it, or who studied it later, one truth remained: the Eastern Front had been obliterated in 3 weeks, leaving the path to Berlin open and sealing the fate of the Third Reich. If you want to understand how modern warfare was redefined, how operational art became history, and how a meticulously prepared army could achieve what seemed impossible, this is the story. The Vistula-Oder offensive was the triumph of strategy, logistics, and human will. A 23-day storm that erased an empire's eastern defenses and reshaped the end of the Second World War. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most decisive campaigns of World War II, hit the like button, subscribe for more untold stories from history, and click the bell icon to never miss an episode.